Okay, once you've had your coffee, get your seat. We're going to get started. We have a very full day today, so we want to try to stay on schedule. And as you saw in your folders, we have a very special addition to our program. We're incredibly fortunate in this important day of discussions about and dialogue about detention to have with us Grover Norquist, the president of Americans for Tax Reform and a leading advocate of reform of both the criminal justice system and the immigration system, which is what we're talking about here today. So his full bio is in your packets. I'm not going to go over it here, but I will tell you that in this town, he doesn't need much introduction. And he is known for breaking orthodoxy and common sense. So we're very pleased because those two qualities are something that's much in need in the discussion about immigration detention. So we're going to get right to it. Thank you for joining us.
Certainly.
We will have a conversation here for 10 or 15 minutes, and if we have time, we'll take questions at the end. So, Mr. Norquist, Grover, if I may, you have called for reduction in government spending by reducing incarceration and prison terms, and have supported this new Leahy-Paul bill called the Justice Safety Valve Act, and which would permit judges to depart from some mandatory minimum sentences when it wouldn't jeopardize public safety. And you're a leading proponent of this organization that we're very interested in learning more about, Right on Crime. Could you tell us a little bit about that organization and about the principles that animate that?
Sure. Right on Crime is, right now, it's run out of Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is sort of the heritage or Cato of Texas, and has worked on how to reform, improve prisons and the judicial process. I started getting involved maybe a decade ago with a group, maybe 10 people in a room, talking about how to reform the criminal justice system. How many federal laws do you need? We thought at the time there were 2,000. Turns out there are about 4,000 that can put you in prison, federal laws alone, and then all sorts of questions. I realized over time that everybody in the room except me had either been in prison or had a immediate family member in prison. So part of the reason that some people got involved is personal knowledge. I mean, some of these were legislators who thought the job was to throw as many bad people in prison and leave them there as long as possible. End of story. Somebody else would take over and make it all work from there. Then they got put in prison. They said, well, you know, there's some other stuff going on here. So that was an interesting process. But while that was going on here in D.C., we ran into folks out of Texas who were having some real successes in getting some laws changed in Texas to have alternatives to incarceration, to prioritizing who do you want in prison and for how long, what's the advantage of keeping 75-year-olds in prison for another 2 years. Though some of it cost-driven. Texas was looking at something like a couple $2 billion because they thought they're going to put another 17,000 people in prison moving forward. And they ended up saving that money, not putting that many more people in prison, and then looking at what worked, and then that going state to state. So Right on Crime was an example of conservatives, free market guys generally make a list of all the annoying things government's doing that they ought not to do at all and focus on those. And don't focus as much as I think we need to on, okay, there's certain things that are like mentioned in the Constitution from time to time, and with the exception of the post office, they're a good idea to have the government run. And we ought to spend some time and effort making sure those are run properly and competently and less expensively, instead of deciding, well, the Pentagon will spend it wisely and the prison system will spend it wisely and the prosecutors are right. That's not necessarily the way to bet all the time. So taking some of the focus that skeptics of government action have towards things that aren't mentioned in the Constitution and perhaps should not be done by our government or any government, and focus on the things that should be done by government, that are legitimate government functions, and ask, how do we do them better, and what are we trying to do? What is success? And on crime, success is having fewer people impacted as victims of crime. You don't measure it by how hard you whack the guys who misbehave, but by how few people are being messed with by bad guys. And hopefully having the smallest footprint on people's lives that the government can within the context of keeping crime reduced. And I think one of the advantages conservatives had on Right on Crime, and why we've had a lot of success, because there was a list of Texas things that we're then taking around, is if you took the same idea, and I've testified in Florida and Missouri and other states, if I start off by saying there's a really great idea Vermont has, I don't think I could sell it in New Hampshire. But if you say Texas has this idea, they go, okay, we're listening. Say Texas has been doing this for 4 years. Now we're really listening. Crime has continued to fall in Texas faster than other places. Okay, now we're really listening. It works. Oh, and by the way, nobody's lost an election over these reforms, which is another big selling point. So Right on Crime is taking a right-of-center approach towards crime, recognizing it saves money. You don't want to lead with that. You want to lead with, we're going to keep people safe. And it also happens to cost less money for taxpayers. So that's been very interesting. And so there's been a big sea change in the conservative community on Right on Crime. Matter of fact, almost all the innovative thinking on the criminal justice issue is coming from Right on Crime. You don't have some competing bloc on the right going, no, longer sentences and more mass incarceration, which, and I have in my sort of criminal justice file something done during Bush 41, which was written all about how if we just put another 900,000 people in prison, that would solve all our problems. That's literally the direction in which they were going, and we did go on mass, large-scale incarceration. That's petered out. That's not there isn't some group, institution, personality making the case.
Congress has not gotten that memo yet. I think it's part of the reason we're talking about this today.
The advantage of federalism is that there are 57 states, and we can pick a few of them and start moving from there, and then explain to these guys.
As a Texas girl, I always love it when I hear that Texas got it right, especially if you read the Washington Post today. They don't get it right on everything, but it's great to hear about this effort, and it's something I think that was a real bipartisan effort in Texas that seems to be catching on in other states. I mean, it sounds like there are, and a lot of them are in the South. South Carolina, I think. Florida's another one.
South Dakota's making some progress.
Where this idea is really kind of taking root. And part of it is, kind of state leaders very close to the problem, really pragmatic about this and not ideological.
And there are larger numbers in the state and local jails and prisons than the feds.
Yeah. So, one of the things that we want to do here is to replicate that around the immigration detention debate, such as it is. And I guess it would be great to hear, it's good to hear about the political dynamic from you, because that has been, I think, a real impediment to the debate, certainly in Congress, around immigration and immigration detention. Now we have this window, and we want to take some of the learning from the criminal justice reform debate and see if that can translate well into the immigration reform debate. The Texas Public Policy Foundation supports the use of these alternatives over incarceration in the criminal justice system. Can you talk just a little bit about how those work and whether they're viewed across the political spectrum as effective?
Texas and some other places the state puts some money out, and it gives you more flexibility on alternatives to incarceration, everything from ankle bracelets and GPS to calling in to how do you have more communication between parole and probation officers and folks who are on parole, probation, awaiting trial, so that people don't wander off. And you have to make the case, as I think they have in Texas and some other places. And actually, Hawaii has done a few interesting things as well, where you can get more cooperation with showing up for trial and not becoming recidivist with these, rather as opposed to more expensive incarceration. I mean, I just spoke to the Stanford Law School guys Thursday, and they spend $50,000 a person per year for prison. And it's like 25 in Texas and some other states, but it's 50,000 a year in California. That's the other thing that's helped conservatives to understand is they've unionized all of the prison guards, okay? So the idea that they're voting for you because they're tough on crime, and they're massive donors to the modern Democratic Party, which now causes problems in the Democratic Party on some of these reforms we're talking about, because they view some of these laws as jobs for the boys, which is unhelpful. But you were talking about the changes on right on crime, conservatives rethinking how many laws there should be, how many people should be in prison, for how long, and, okay, what's the alternative? Technology has allowed some of it. How many people have watched White Collar, the TV show? This is not a popular show? I thought everybody's watching.
You're a fan of
Well, I thought that was one of the reasons we were able to make the sale. It's about a guy who wears an ankle bracelet. He's sort of a retired criminal, but the FBI keeps him on the ankle bracelet. And I thought if enough people saw that show, they'd go, I know what that is. That works. It works on TV. Evidently, not as widely viewed, at least in D.C. Show's fairly successful. It makes money. But there is this sense, maybe the GPS people popularly understand, you can too know where somebody is, you can know where cars are and so on, and you don't need to have somebody in a prison trial. Now we're able to, and we can reduce actual crimes and recidivism with that. Now, so you have one thing going on here, and now there's this big change in the center-right thinking on immigration. So you've got criminal justice, imprisonment questions here, immigration questions here, and that's the big shift you're seeing is on the center-right, the position or perceived position on immigration was driven by 24 radio talk show hosts screaming loudly, even though the modern Republican Party has nominated the most pro-immigrant presidential candidate since Reagan. And at the height of some of this nonsense, we nominated McCain, who was viewed as the most open to be supportive of immigration. The business community, which has always been pro-immigration going back 100 years, was silent for most of the last decade, and now has become an advocate of reform and more significant numbers of legal immigration and a path to legalization, if not citizenship, for people who are here. And then all the various communities of faith who are also somewhat silent, quieter. Now you're going to have land here later with the Southern Baptists. The National Evangelical Association has 40 biblical quotes for Lent, one per day, all dealing with immigration and the stranger. So there's been the Mormon Church, Latter-day Saints, is the most pro-immigrant church in the country. The Catholics have refound their footing on this one. So we're having a lot of the communities of faith, the business community. So if you're a Republican congressman or senator, who is your constituency? The radio talk show hosts or the guys who go to church and the guys who have jobs? I mean, this is, so that's been this very significant shift in the right elected officials' perception of where the center-right Republican Party is, which I think is very healthy and is a more accurate reflection of where voters are. The guy who ran as the anti-immigrant candidate was Pat Buchanan, got 1% of the vote. So the idea that there's actually this tremendous interest in Pat Buchanan's worldview on immigration, we kind of tested that one. So while immigration's moving this way and criminal justice moving that way, the overlap there are the question of incarceration and holding people pending deportation or deportation hearings. How many people do you want in prison? How useful is that? How expensive is it? How humane is it? So I think, and that overlap of the Venn diagram has been growing.
And then this, I mean, what we would like to talk about today also is how do we, elevate this issue in the context of the overall debate? Because, the immigration reform debate, there's not a lot of talk about the detention reform. At the same time that we're, in a budget crunch and Congress's approach has been to mandate 34,000 people have to be in immigration beds every day without it, which violates not only sound fiscal policy, I think probably, but also individual dignity and the idea that, if you deprive somebody of their liberty, there ought to at least be somebody making a judgment about whether that's necessary in order to keep Americans safe. So what do you think we can be doing in the midst of these different plates, as you described them, kind of moving together to raise?
Well, I think you work both. The whole question of the right on crime idea of conservatives rethinking how much does this cost. Let's take a look at some of those numbers and how much things cost. The Heritage Foundation has evidently, they put out a study back in 2007, which was static models, and according to Cato and others, terribly flawed, and they're going to redo it with all the same problems of static models. Looking at the costs, they want to say they're costs of having people become legal or citizens, they're huge costs to what we're doing. And we're not looking at those. I mean, those numbers need to be popularized, because if you went to somebody and say, how much are we spending incarcerating people on immigration issues, I don't know that many congressmen could tell you the answer, but the average radio talk show host doesn't know that. How much less expensive could you do it with some of these alternatives to incarceration? Those numbers are there, but they're not popularized yet. And we have a network of conservatives who are open to rethinking mass incarceration. The idea that people can't flip is just wrong. I testified when we came on the mandatory minimum issue, and when we were trying to change the laws from crack cocaine, same amount of cocaine, crack cocaine got you 100 times as much time in prison as white powder cocaine. And that number was pulled out of Rangel's ear, 100 to 1, meaning very bad. Okay, this is the way legislators legislate. I don't like this message, bad. Okay, thank you, Rangel. Anyway, then a little bit later, they decided that was a little bit much, and we went to 18 to 1, pulled out of somebody else's ear. But anyway, 18 was less than 100, so it's progress. And we actually had this conversation where everybody agreed that 100 to 1 was goofy and something closer to 1 to 1 would make more sense. But nobody wanted to go first. And it was fascinating to see this dance. And that's why depoliticizing these issues helps to move it forward. Right on Crime has done that. When it moves forward at state legislative level, these things are bipartisan. They start on the right, then the left goes, you guys are really for that? You're on the record, you've put it in writing, you've said speeches, you've done that. Okay, now we can switch. Because if you talk the liberals into stepping out first, they're afraid you'll run them over. Oh yeah, you're going to trick me into saying something liberal on crime and then yell at me. So moving out there, I think, has been helpful. People still remember William Horton and furloughs and stuff like that, and that can be very damaging politically if you step out on that way. And that's why I think it's very important that here and in Right on Crime, we talk about, we're not talking about being soft on crime, there's other questions about how do you change the immigration law so you have less mass incarceration because you have different laws. But given that, making sure reducing crime, reducing recidivism, while spending less money and doing it in a much more humane way. If people can be back with their families while you're having a conversation about whether they're going to prison or they're going to be deported or they can stay, it's just less disruptive for everybody, and it makes everybody's life better off, and they're much happier, and you're happier, and the neighbors are happier.
So we're done, right? I think, one of the things that one of the reasons we're so grateful that you're here with us today is that there has been a real reluctance to deal with this issue in the political realm, at least at the national level. And we want to change that. I mean, the panel that we heard from this morning, I think, was really striking in its agreement about how nonsensical Congress both mandating bed occupancy and throwing more money at immigration detention than the executive branch has asked for time and again, especially seems crazy in the current environment. But as you say, this is a win-win-win on several levels if we can move the political process in the right direction.
The political process moves forward when the American people are ready for it. I mean, elected officials are rarely out ahead of where they think the American people are, but they can also misunderstand where people are. There are a lot of Republicans who thought everybody was out there as terribly anti-immigrant because they were listening to guys on talk radio sound like that, and then they're busy losing elections in 06, or 08 in particular. The guys who had been for comprehensive who flipped did poorly. So it's not a vote-moving issue. It's not an issue that is helpful to people getting re-elected. And step one is convincing somebody, if you take this position, you won't lose an election. Okay. Once you convince them of that, then they're willing to listen to silly questions like whether it's a good idea or not, and whether it would be helpful. But first, get over the hump of, are you committing political suicide? And I think we now have more voices on the right, Rubio, Rand Paul, and others going, we have to fundamentally reform immigration so you don't have 11 million people you're thinking of incarcerating, to none of those guys, or almost none of those guys, you're thinking of incarcerating. That solves a whole bunch of the problem. If you let people have some earned legal status and path to citizenship as you move forward on that, that sense is moving forward much more rapidly than you've seen other issues switch. And I think the reason I said earlier is that both the various communities of faith have all come up with different and loud voices on that. The business community has. And the number of radio talk show hosts on the annoying side of that issue have reduced in numbers and in tone. And so it's no longer something where somebody looks up and says, oh, I see, we're picking up teams, shirts, and skins. I'm a Republican, so I must be over here. That's gone. But Congress will be the lagging indicator just because they want to double check that the ice is thick enough to walk out on.
Right, right. We, you know, at Human Rights First, our motto, American Ideals, Universal Values, this is one of those issues, I think, which is a core to American identity. That people come here to be part of a society because of its values. And that's one of the reasons that we are so animated about how we treat people who come here, whether they're refugees or people who are coming here to work, and to focus on making sure that the immigration detention system is consistent with those ideals. And that's something I think where, you know, you can see does not cut across party lines.
Well, that's one of the reasons I'm optimistic that we can get there, both on questions of criminal justice reform, immigration reform, and again, the overlap in the Venn diagram, because you actually do have people largely agreeing. It's just that when they get, you know, when people throw out phrases and they go, oh, that's amnesty, and then their thought process is shut down, then it's a little hard to have a conversation. But when you open that up, you've got guys right, left, and center who basically want to have a humane and civil society, and who, remember, we all had relatives who were immigrants at some point. So it helps.
I think we have a few minutes, and if there are mics, please identify yourself and be brief.
Sure. Hi, good morning. My name is Nicole Porter with the Sentencing Project. And I get the conversation around alternatives for people held pretrial, but my question is specifically for people incarcerated for criminal penalties for entry or reentry, and their increase in admissions inside of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And I'm wondering where the right, or Right on Crime specifically, stands on that issue, particularly in terms of looking at alternatives and efforts to stop any expansion of federal prison capacity meant to meet the increased demand for housing, well, for incarcerating people convicted of those penalties.
I've not focused on that one in particular. I've been looking mostly at both state laws, but also some of the questions of mandatory minimums that you have at the federal law. And I think there's an openness to rethinking mandatory minimums. I testified on that, and I was looking at the list of crimes, you know, 30 and 40 years for dirty pictures and stuff like that, and 5 years for treason. So some of these issues you're going, depending on how much TV time you can get for your subject, that's how big the mandatory minimum went up. I mean, it was a little bit odd on some of these questions. As to the specifics on entry and reentry, I'm not up to speed on how many people are in prison for that. I mean, sentenced on federal levels. What are the numbers today? And when you say they're increasing, can we get her a mic? I'm just...
Sure. Well, according to the CRS report that was published earlier this year, the number of people admitted is about 30% inside of the federal system on an annual basis. I think they were looking at fiscal year 2010 numbers. And just quickly on the mandatory minimums
30%.
30% of
admissions
inside of the Federal Bureau of Prisons were for immigration.
Sounds like they're going to Stanford. You mean guys who are
admits inside of the Federal Bureau of Prisons was for immigration offenses, of which could be entry or reentry.
Oh, okay.
The two criminal penalties that are currently on the books. But just quickly on the mandatory minimums, the current statutory framework on reentry is 0 to 20, but there is a mandatory minimum bill that was introduced by Representative Isa that would create a staggered mandatory minimum framework. And while that bill has no co-sponsors, I believe I am concerned that it could be amended into the CIR vehicle as it moves, so that's something that Right on Crime should be paying attention to.
Thank you.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, even though it says we have to end. One more question. Okay. You missed your window. I want to thank you so much, Grover, for joining us. It's really been terrific.